Hello, everyone. My name is Mohammed. I'm from the University of Glasgow. It's a pleasure to be here today to present this work titled Are Thermal Attacks Ubiquitous When Non-Expert Attackers Use Off-the-Shelf Thermal Cameras? So this is an international collaborative project between the Bundeswehr University in Munich, the German University in Cairo, and the University of Glasgow.
Let me start by showing you this video from our CHI 2017 paper about thermal attacks. So what happens in this video is that a person enters a pin on his mobile phone, he interacts a bit, and then he goes to get coffee. Meanwhile, somebody comes in with a thermal camera and takes a thermal image of the touchscreen. And there you can see not only which digits were pressed, but you can also see the order in which they were pressed, because the most recently touched digit has the highest temperature. And this happens because when humans touch mobile devices, heat is transferred from their body to the mobile device, or to the touchscreen in that case. And this results in heat traces which could be used to reconstruct the entered passwords. Previous work that studied thermal attacks either used very expensive thermal cameras, like for example, the work of Mauri et al. Used a thermal camera that costs $18,000. The work by Abdurrahman et al. Used one that costs almost $6,000, so the Optus PI one here that you see on the right. So they either use high-end thermal cameras that are expensive, or they used automated image processing techniques. So for example, the work by Abdurrahman et al. And the work by Kazmarek et al., they used automated image processing techniques that analyze the thermal images and try to infer the passwords from them. And the aim of these works were to show if a thermal camera or if a thermal image is taken of a surface on which a password was entered, be it a keyboard or a touchscreen, they showed that it's possible to use image processing techniques to infer what the passwords are. But since then, thermal cameras have become much cheaper than before. So for example, today you can buy a thermal camera from Amazon for less than £230. And this thermal camera, you can attach it to any mobile device. And by doing that, you get yourself a thermal camera that is capable of doing thermal attacks. What is missing, and subsequently what we study in this paper, is that it's not clear to what extent non-expert users who do not have the technical skills to perform image processing or automated detection approaches, how well can these people carry out thermal attacks using off-the-shelf thermal cameras that you can just buy from Amazon, for example? And this question is important because if non-experts can perform thermal attacks without any technical background, then this means that the majority of the population can perform this attack. So studying threats by untrained attackers sheds light on how realistic the risk of thermal attacks is and how ubiquitous thermal attacks can be. To determine how well non-expert users of affordable thermal cameras can perform thermal attacks, we conducted two studies. The first one aimed to collect a dataset of thermal images of touchscreens and touchpads. So to do this, we invited 25 participants who entered passwords using two graphical authentication schemes. The graphical authentication schemes, they allowed input using touch gestures or touch taps. So gestures are when you move your finger over a touchscreen or a touchpad to perform a certain shape, and a taps is when you just press on a location on the screen, on the touch screen or touchpad. Passwords were entered on a smartphone and a laptop, so through the smartphone's touchscreen and the laptop's touchpad. And thermal images were taken using the FLIR C2 compact thermal camera, which is a relatively cheap thermal camera that costs less than $450. And then in the second study, we evaluated how well non-experts can perform thermal attacks. So we invited 18 participants and they visually inspected the thermal images collected in the first study. And then they tried to guess the entered passwords. In any security study, there has to be a threat model that defines the scenario in which the attack takes place. So in our threat model, a user authenticates and then somebody takes a thermal image of their interface. So the thermal image is taken using a low-cost thermal camera, and then the attacker visually inspects the thermal image and tries to guess the password. Both of our studies followed a within-subjects design, and there were two independent variables. The first variable is the input type. So we compared touch gestures to touch taps. So gestures, as you can see here on the left, they are shapes that are drawn on the touchscreen or the touchpad. And on the right, you can see examples of touch taps where you have an interface or a cue, some images, for example, or this could be a pin pad as well. And then the user has to tap on different locations to enter the password. The second independent variable was the input interface. So we compared the smartphone's touchscreen to a laptop's touchpad. You can see images from the setup of the study below, where people were entering passwords on smartphone touchscreens and laptop touchpads. So now I will tell you more details about both studies. So in study 1, the aim was to collect a data set. So we invited 25 participants, 9 of them were females, 16 were males. The experiment took place in a temperature-controlled room. The temperature was fixed at 24 degrees. The participants first were introduced to the study. They signed the consent form, and then we introduced the interfaces and how they should enter passwords. After that, they entered 24 passwords from a predefined list that we provided. So the predefined list of passwords had passwords, gesture-based passwords and tap-based passwords, and both lists were decided based on previous work. So we used the most commonly used passwords from previous work. So for example, for gestures, we know from previous work that when picking gesture passwords, people usually use gestures that look like letters. So for example, the letter T, S, or Z. So we put this into consideration. And then the thermal images were taken 4 seconds after each password was entered. The data of participant 19 was discarded because they had a very low hand temperature. So their fingers were actually cold, so they didn't leave enough heat traces to be detected on the interfaces. So therefore, we discarded their data. The second study focused on analyzing the thermal attacks. So we invited 18 participants, 8 females and 10 males. The participants visually inspected the images collected in the previous study, and then they provided 3 guesses for each image. Only the best guess of those were considered for analysis. And then we measured the correct guesses, the number of correct guesses, and the number of partially correct guesses. So a correct guess is easy. So it's basically in case of gestures, they have to find the correct shape and the correct direction of the gesture. And in case of the taps, they have to find the correct position and the correct order of the taps. As for partially correct guesses, they had to get the correct shape, but not necessarily the correct direction of the gesture. So if they get the correct shape but incorrect direction, we would consider this a partially correct guess. In case of taps, we considered it a partially correct guess when they correctly got the positions, but they didn't get the correct order of the taps. In that case, we considered it a partially correct guess. Each participant performed 24 attacks. Half of them were against gesture-based passwords, and the other half were against tap-based passwords. The order of the conditions was counterbalanced using a Latin square to avoid learning effects. And we adopted a scoring mechanism and a scoreboard to encourage participants. So basically, when participants made a correct guess, they received 2 points, and when they made a partially correct guess, they got only 1 point. And we kept track of the scores to encourage people to do their best in trying to infer the passwords. So let's take a look at the results. So there are 3 main finding here is that tapping is significantly more secure than touch gestures. So as you can see here in the percentages, the taps on both interfaces were actually less likely to be detected using thermal images compared to gestures. The second main finding concerns touch gestures. So we found that they are more secure when entered on touch screens compared to touchpads. So when entering them on laptop touchpads, they are more likely to be attacked through thermal images. And you can see this reflected here in the percentages, and this difference was statistically significant. The third finding is that tapping is significantly more secure when entered on touchpads compared to touchscreens. And a reason that this happens is that when people are trying to tap using a touchpad, they actually need to first navigate their pointer or the mouse to the location where they want to tap. And this results in additional heat traces that are difficult to, that actually, blend with the heat traces resulting from authentication, and it makes it harder for the attacker to infer or to determine which heat traces belong to the interaction part and which heat traces belong to the authentication part. So this is why it becomes more complicated to attack passwords, tap passwords on touchpads. So based on these results, we came up with some recommendations. So first, we should try to use authentication schemes that do not leave heat traces. So examples are authentication schemes that use modalities such as gaze, for example. So there has been a lot of work on using eye gaze for authentication on mobile devices and laptops. And actually, nowadays, we have laptops and mobile devices that are well equipped to do eye tracking. So this could be an opportunity for future work. Also, we should use authentication schemes where the touch input depends on a cue. So in that case, if you have to observe a cue on the screen and accordingly your touch input changes, then this means that the attacker does not only need to know how you responded to the cue, but he needs also to know what the cue is. So this makes thermal attacks more difficult. And there has been also some research about this, which we cite in our paper. So if you're interested in this direction, also take a look at the related work section and the discussion section of our paper. The third direction is to use biometric passwords or biometric authentication, such as fingerprint and facial recognition. Of course, these also come with their own limitations. So, for example, a famous limitation of biometric authentication is that it collects a lot of private information about the users. So this in itself could be a privacy risk. Second, also, it does not guarantee the consent of the user. So somebody could force your finger against your phone to unlock it, and this way you are exposing your data without your consent. Finally, also things like fingerprint authentication need to be evaluated against thermal attacks. So this has not been done before, and this is a direction for future work. Our fourth recommendation is that whenever you have to use authentication or you have to use touch for authentication, then we recommend using taps instead of touch gestures when possible, because this is where our results show that that actually touch taps are more secure. And this is also in line with previous work where pins were more secure compared to Android patterns, for example. So Android patterns are a form of touch gestures on mobile devices. So this shows that there are some similarities between attacker success when visually inspecting the thermal images compared to using automated approaches. Finally, these are the main takeaway messages from our work. So touch input is generally vulnerable to thermal attacks, but if you have to use them, then use taps instead of gestures because they are more secure against thermal attacks. Second, touchpads are more secure than touchscreens against thermal attacks. So for example, in cases where you have both options, for example, if you're using a laptop that has a touchpad and also a touch screen, it's better to enter your password using the touchpad rather than the touchscreen, or this would be more secure against thermal attacks. Finally, thermal attacks can be performed by non-experts by merely visually inspecting the thermal images taken using a low-cost thermal camera. And this is the most important outcome of this or observation in this work, that even non-expert users can use cheap or affordable thermal cameras that they can buy online or from stores for a low cost, and they can use them to invade others' privacy. So this underlines the importance of addressing thermal attacks and putting them into consideration, because this is an attack that almost anybody could do. So finally, some acknowledgements. So this work was partially supported by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Studienstiftung des Deutschen Volkes and the DFG in Germany. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or want to get in touch, please don't hesitate. These are my contact details. Thank you.